My mother loved my good-for-nothing brother who would abandon her whenever she faced problems, while I helped and supported her. Yet, she transferred the entire inheritance to him. So I told her, I've always been the responsible one in the family, and honestly, it's a title I never asked for but somehow ended up with. My name's Tom, and if you look at my family dynamic from the outside, you'd think my younger brother, Kevin, and I were raised in two completely different households. I'm the eldest, and for as long as I can remember, my mom, Linda, has leaned on me like I'm her second husband. It sounds weird, but there's no other way to put it. I was barely a teenager when my dad walked out on us, just packed his things one day and vanished. I remember that night like it was yesterday. Mom sobbing at the kitchen table, bottles clinking as she drowned her anger in cheap wine, and me standing there, not knowing what to do. I think that was the moment my life took a turn. Instead of being the carefree, slightly awkward 13-year-old I was supposed to be, I became Tom, the responsible. I looked after Mom, picked up extra chores, made sure my grades didn't slip, and, without realizing it, set myself up as her emotional crutch. Kevin? Well, he was 5 at the time, practically oblivious. The divorce affected him too, I'm sure, but he was young enough to grow up with Dad being a faint memory, not a constant ache like it was for me. Over the years, that gap between us only widened. Kevin became the golden boy, the charming, carefree younger son who could do no wrong in Mom's eyes. Meanwhile, I was the one handling her meltdowns, running her errands, and making sure she didn't miss her doctor's appointments. Take last Tuesday, for instance. I got a call from Mom around 7 a.m. I hadn't even had my coffee yet. She was sobbing, saying her car wouldn't start, and she had an emergency doctor's appointment she couldn't miss. She lives about 45 minutes away, but I dropped everything, drove over, and got her to that appointment. I didn't get back to my own life until late afternoon. When I asked Kevin if he could maybe take on some of these mom emergencies, since he lives just 10 minutes from her, he shrugged and said, "She'll be fine. Besides, I'm busy." Busy doing what? Exactly? Playing video games? Going out with friends? I'm almost positive that's all he does. My wife, Olivia, has been patient beyond words. She's seen this pattern for years. Mom calling me up, me bending over backward to help, while Kevin sits pretty with zero responsibility. Olivia's dropped subtle hints that maybe it's time I set some boundaries, but she knows better than anyone how complicated this all is for me. I owe it to Mom. She raised us alone. She struggled, and I can't just walk away. But sometimes, the resentment festers. I watch Kevin breeze through life without a care, without an ounce of guilt, and I can't help but wonder why I'm the only one stuck under this weight. One evening, Olivia and I had a rare quiet dinner at home. She looked at me over her glass of wine and said, "Tom, have you thought about what this is doing to you?" She wasn't trying to start a fight. It was just a simple question, but it hit hard. I hadn't stopped to think about the toll it's taking, how I always feel on edge, ready to jump if Mom needs me, while Kevin gets to be the carefree son who only shows up for family dinners or on holidays. A few weeks later, Mom called me at 2 a.m., crying and saying she was feeling suffocated in her house, that the walls were closing in on her, and she needed to get out of here. Half asleep, I threw on some clothes and drove out there, half convinced she was having some kind of breakdown. When I arrived, she was waiting outside with a packed bag, saying she needed a few nights away. I took her back to my place without question, but it put a strain on Olivia, who woke up to find Mom settling into our guest room at 3 a.m. The next morning, I confronted her, asking why she hadn't called Kevin first, considering he's literally right down the road. She gave me this pitiful look and said, "Tom, you know Kevin's not good with these things. I need you." And just like that, I was pulled back in, even though I knew it wasn't fair. Kevin could handle it just fine. He just didn't want to. And I'm stuck playing hero because Mom thinks he's too delicate for the burden. But how much of that is true, and how much of it is just a story she's told herself over the years? Maybe it's easier to lean on me because I never said no. This routine has gone on so long that I can practically predict the calls now. And the craziest part? Kevin just continues his life, unaffected, as if he's not part of this family at all. Last Thanksgiving, he strolled in an hour late, brought a store-bought pie, and was glued to his phone the entire time. Mom didn't say a word, just flashed him a tired smile. Meanwhile, I'd spent the entire week helping her cook, setting up the decorations she insisted on, and cleaning up afterward while he left without lifting a finger. Then came the bombshell. Mom recently confessed, in a rare moment of clarity, that she's left the house to Kevin in her will. I was speechless. After everything, all the late-night calls, the hospital visits, the emotional hand-holding, she's giving everything to him? I didn't want her house. It's not about the material things. But it stung to know that after all these years, Kevin would inherit something that, frankly, I've invested more of myself into than he ever has. I confronted her about it, carefully, but the conversation went sideways fast. She got defensive, saying that Kevin needs it more, that he's not as stable as I am, and that she just wants him to be okay. I had to bite my tongue to keep from saying something I'd regret, but I think she knew I was furious. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, Olivia's soft breathing beside me. I wondered how I could keep going like this. How many more sleepless nights would I spend for a family that didn't seem to care about what I wanted? You'd think that after years of doing everything for my mom, I'd be used to her favoritism by now. But no matter how much time passes, it still gets under my skin. Kevin's golden child status isn't just a family joke. It's a reality that affects every part of my life, and frankly, it's exhausting. Take last Saturday. Mom had asked me to come over and help her sort through some paperwork. I'd been there a few hours when Kevin burst in, looking disheveled and anxious. He didn't even glance at me, just went straight to Mom, muttering about how he was struggling this month and barely keeping his head above water. I knew exactly what was coming next. Without hesitation, Mom reached into her purse and handed him a wad of cash, no questions asked. She always had this emergency stash, just in case, but it seemed Kevin was the only one who benefited from it. I couldn't hold back this time. Mom, are you serious? You know he's just going to waste it, right? This isn't the first time. She turned to me with that classic disappointed look. Tom, he needs help. Life is hard for him right now. Not everyone is as stable as you. There it was, the line she always used to excuse him. She acted like Kevin's struggles were some force of nature, while my own efforts and sacrifices were just expected, unworthy of praise or acknowledgement. And Kevin? He didn't even bother thanking her. He took the cash, mumbled something about catching up later, and was out the door in minutes. No concern about how hard it might be for Mom to constantly bail him out. No shame, no guilt, just a smug confidence that Mom would always be there to fix things for him, even if it meant putting herself in a tough spot financially. A couple of days later, I got a call from Mom. She sounded embarrassed, almost apologetic. Tom, I hate to ask, but could you maybe lend me a little until my next check comes through? Things are just tight right now. Tight? They're only tight because she's bailing Kevin out every other week. But I bit my tongue, knowing that if I said what I really thought, it would just end in a fight. I drove over that evening, gave her the money, and tried to leave without a lecture, but she caught me before I made it out the door. Tom, I hope you know I don't take this for granted. You're so reliable, and I know I can always count on you, she said, putting a hand on my shoulder. There it was again. I'm reliable. I have my life together. But I knew what that really meant. I'd never be Kevin. I'd never be the one who gets her attention, sympathy, or endless forgiveness. I was the one who patched things up when she was short on cash or needed something fixed. Kevin got her love, her support, and her constant sympathy. I just got her needs. The breaking point came when I found out she had co-signed a loan for him. A loan. She's been on a tight budget since she retired, and here she is, putting herself on the line for Kevin's latest investment, a business venture he claimed would be life-changing. When I pressed her about it, she told me it was just a small amount, nothing to worry about. But I saw the paperwork on her counter. It was thousands. She wouldn't let me help her with it or get involved in any way. It was a family matter, she said, her voice firm, as though I wasn't also part of this family. Kevin, meanwhile, was nowhere to be found. He'd taken off for a business trip, posting pictures on social media of him and his friends lounging by a beach, drinks in hand. The so-called investment he needed the money for? Just another excuse for a luxury getaway. And Mom, naive as she can be, bought every word of his story. It was Olivia who finally snapped me out of it. She sat me down one night, her eyes full of sympathy but also frustration. "Tom, you're going to drive yourself insane if you keep doing this. It's not fair to you, to us, or to our own lives together." She was right, of course. But walking away isn't that simple. Mom needs me. I couldn't live with myself if I just left her in Kevin's reckless hands. So, I went to talk to her again, hoping she'd see reason this time. I tried to explain how her constant support for Kevin was hurting her financially, how she was jeopardizing her own future. But she just brushed me off, saying, "Kevin just needs a little more time. He'll figure things out." I realized in that moment that there was no changing her mind. She was willing to sacrifice anything, her savings, her health, her peace of mind, to keep Kevin afloat. And Kevin? He was more than willing to let her do it, so long as it meant he didn't have to face the consequences of his actions. I guess you could say I've always been the dependable one. It sounds noble, like something out of a TV show. The stable older brother who holds everything together. But in reality, it's exhausting, and the title I carry comes with the constant price of putting off my own life for the sake of my mom and, by extension, Kevin. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up. Every time I start to think I might get a break, something happens, and I'm right back in that same endless cycle, pulling everyone else's weight while Kevin stands in the spotlight, soaking up all the praise mom has left to give. Last week, for example, I had a huge project at work. My boss, Nick, a decent guy but one who doesn't tolerate excuses, gave me a shot at leading a team on a major account, the kind of opportunity I've been waiting for. The stakes were high, and for once, I wanted to focus on something that was just for me, without family drama pulling me away. But, of course, that didn't last. The night before our first major presentation, Mom called. Her voice was frantic, filled with that familiar worry that made my stomach sink immediately. "Tom, it's about Kevin," she started, and I already knew where this was going. Kevin had called her in a panic, claiming he was in trouble and needed her to come pick him up from a bar across town. Apparently, he'd spent the night drinking after another failed business deal and, as usual, had nowhere to turn but her. Mom insisted that she couldn't drive herself, blaming her bad knee or terrible night vision, or whatever excuse she was using that day. And so, I found myself driving halfway across the city in the middle of the night, picking up my intoxicated brother from a dingy dive bar while my project sat unfinished on my desk. When I got there, Kevin was sprawled on a booth, grinning like an idiot. He didn't even look surprised to see me. He just laughed and said, "Hey, big bro, knew you'd come through." No thanks, no apology, nothing. He just assumed I'd be there, like always. I wanted to shake him, to yell at him for putting me in this position yet again, but instead, I just got him in the car, drove him to his place, and made sure he got inside. I barely slept that night, and the next morning at work, I could feel the exhaustion in my bones. My boss noticed too, pulling me aside after the presentation to ask if everything was okay. I nodded, pasted on a fake smile, and mumbled something about a family emergency, but he looked unconvinced. It didn't help that Kevin decided to post pictures on social media later that day, showing off his wild night out with a few buddies, complete with the caption, "Living my best life." I couldn't believe it. Here I was, exhausted and on edge because of him, while he celebrated a night he couldn't even remember. That night, Olivia finally confronted me. She was fed up, and I didn't blame her. She'd been watching me go through this cycle for years, and now it was affecting her too. "Tom," she said, "I love you, but this has to stop. Your life isn't just about fixing everyone else's problems." I wanted to tell her she was right, to promise her things would change, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I was caught in this endless cycle with my mom and Kevin, and it felt impossible to break free. Whenever I tried, something happened to pull me back in. And Mom? She never saw any of this. To her, Kevin was still the one who needed support, the one who was trying his best. She'd call me every week with some new story about how proud she was of him, how he'd taken on a new investment opportunity, or how he was exploring his passions. Never mind that every one of these opportunities ended in a financial disaster, or that his passions changed more frequently than the seasons. But the last straw came when she decided to throw Kevin a surprise birthday party. I knew she was short on cash, thanks to the loan she co-signed for him, yet she insisted on going all out. She even hired a caterer, something she'd never done for me. Not even close. I bit my tongue, helped her plan the whole thing, and paid for a good portion of it, all while she kept gushing about how Kevin deserved a special day. The party itself was a disaster. Kevin showed up an hour late, looking hungover and barely acknowledging any of the guests, most of whom were Mom's friends rather than his. And of course, he spent most of the night glued to his phone or outside smoking with a few buddies he dragged along. Mom was oblivious, though. She kept smiling, kept telling everyone how proud she was of him, and at one point, she even gave a little speech about how lucky she was to have a son like Kevin. I think that was the moment I realized just how deep this cycle went. No matter what Kevin did, no matter how little he cared or how many times he failed, he would always be the golden child in her eyes. And me? I'd always be the dependable one, the one who cleaned up the mess and made sure everything kept running smoothly. If there was ever a moment I realized just how invisible I was in my own family, it was the day I found out about Mom's bequest decision. I'm not sure what I expected, maybe a fair distribution or at least some acknowledgement of everything I'd done for her. But what I learned felt like a slap in the face, as though the years I'd spent sacrificing my time, my energy, and even my own dreams meant nothing. It all started a few weeks ago when Mom asked me to drive her to her attorney's office. She said it was just a routine checkup on some boring paperwork, nothing worth explaining. I didn't question it, just threw on my jacket and helped her into the car like I always did. When we got to the office, I waited outside, scrolling through emails on my phone. I wasn't expecting to be involved. I was just her chauffeur for the day. But then, about 20 minutes in, I heard her voice rising from behind the door. "Yes, I'm sure," she was saying, her tone sharp and insistent. "Kevin needs the support. Tom's stable enough on his own." I froze, my stomach twisting. It took me a moment to process what she just said, but then the truth hit me like a freight train. She was leaving everything to Kevin. The door opened, and Mom stepped out, looking flustered. She glanced at me, gave a tight smile, and said, "All set, Tom. Let's go." I followed her in silence, my mind racing. Every part of me wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but I knew she'd just brush it off, call me dramatic, or say that I was overreacting. Instead, I swallowed my frustration and drove her home, the words "Kevin needs support" echoing in my head. A few days later, I got a call from Aunt Claire. She's my mom's sister, and probably the only person in the family who understands what I go through. She'd heard about Mom's decision through the family grapevine, and she didn't hold back. "Tom, this isn't right. You've given up so much for her, and she's giving everything to Kevin? That boy hasn't done a thing for her in years." Hearing the anger in Claire's voice made me realize how deeply I felt it too. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about respect. Mom saw Kevin as someone who needed help and saw me as the one who'd be fine on his own, even if that meant dismissing everything I'd done. I thanked Aunt Claire for the call and promised her I'd talk to Mom, even though part of me knew it wouldn't make a difference. The next week, I went over to Mom's house, determined to address the issue. I walked in to find her sorting through old family photos, humming softly to herself. I tried to start the conversation gently, not wanting to set her off, but as soon as I mentioned the bequest, her face hardened. "Tom, I know this must be hard to understand, but Kevin, he's not as capable as you," she said, her voice laced with that familiar tone of condescension. "You're strong. You have Olivia and a good career. Kevin, on the other hand, well, he just needs a little extra help." "A little extra help?" I couldn't keep the frustration out of my voice. "Mom, you've given him more extra help than anyone could ever need. You've bailed him out, loaned him money, even co-signed loans for him. What has he done for you in return?" Her face softened, but not with sympathy. It was pity. Pity for Kevin. "Tom, you don't understand. He's trying his best. He just needs someone to believe in him." It was then I realized how deep this went. Mom had built a fantasy around Kevin, a story where he was the struggling, misunderstood son who just needed someone to believe in him, while I was the strong, dependable one who could fend for himself. There was no breaking that illusion, no reasoning with it. I left her house that day feeling hollow. Olivia noticed my mood immediately and tried to get me to talk, but I couldn't find the words. How could I explain that the woman I'd done everything for saw me as nothing more than her safety net? That, in her eyes, my own stability was a reason to overlook everything I'd sacrificed? Days turned into weeks, and I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself. But no matter how hard I worked or how late I stayed, I couldn't escape the nagging thought that I'd never truly mattered to Mom. She saw me as a tool, a means to an end, while Kevin was her project, her purpose. And he knew it too. I saw it in the smug looks he gave me, the way he flaunted his successes on social media, knowing Mom would always be there to clean up his messes. Then came another gut punch. I was over at Mom's one evening, fixing her leaky faucet, a job Kevin could have easily done if he ever showed up, when she casually mentioned that she'd put Kevin as the executor of her will. "He'll handle everything," she said as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "You don't need the extra burden." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Not only was she leaving him everything, but she was also giving him control over her final affairs. I wanted to scream, to tell her that she'd completely lost touch with reality, but I held back. All I could manage was a cold, "Fine, Mom. Whatever you think is best." That night, I went home feeling more defeated than I ever had before. After discovering Mom's decision to leave everything to Kevin and realizing just how deep her loyalty to him ran, something inside me snapped. I'd spent years bending over backward, putting my life on hold to be her dependable son, the one she could count on. And for what? To be dismissed as stable while Kevin got all her attention, support, and even her inheritance. I was done. Well, maybe not completely done, but I knew it was time to start pulling back, little by little, until she had no choice but to turn to Kevin for once. I wasn't entirely sure how to go about it. After all, cutting ties with family isn't easy, especially when you've spent a lifetime being the go-to problem solver. But I had Olivia's support, which gave me the courage to finally make a change. We agreed that I'd start by gradually limiting my help. No more dropping everything to run over whenever Mom called. No more picking up the slack whenever Kevin failed to show up. Instead, I'd make it clear that she needed to start asking him to step up. The first test came faster than I'd expected. It was a Thursday evening, and Olivia and I had just settled in for a rare night off together when my phone buzzed. It was Mom, her voice shaky, complaining that her car had stalled and she was stranded at the grocery store. I clenched my jaw, fighting the automatic urge to say, "I'll be right there." Instead, I took a deep breath and asked, "Have you called Kevin?" There was a long pause. I could practically hear her confusion and frustration through the phone. "Tom, you know Kevin's not reliable with these things. He's busy, and I can't count on him the way I can count on you." I let out a slow exhale. "Mom, he lives 10 minutes away. I'm across town, and it's late. He should be able to help." My voice was calm, but firm. She didn't argue, but I could sense her reluctance. Later that night, I found out from Aunt Claire that she'd ended up getting a cab home after calling Kevin multiple times with no answer. That stung. Not because Kevin had let her down again, but because she hadn't even given him the chance to fail before turning to me. She simply didn't believe he could be the responsible one, and that was on her. Over the next few weeks, I stuck to my plan. Whenever Mom called with a new issue, whether it was a broken appliance or some form she didn't understand, I'd ask if she'd reached out to Kevin first. Sometimes she'd grumble and say she didn't want to bother him, but each time, I held my ground. It wasn't easy. I hated feeling like I was abandoning her, even if just a little. But I had to believe this was for the best. She needed to learn that she couldn't keep relying on me, especially if she was so set on giving Kevin everything in the end. One afternoon, as Olivia and I were preparing to leave for a weekend getaway, Mom called again. This time, it was about a leaking pipe in her bathroom. I'd fixed that damn pipe more times than I could count, but I refused to let it derail my plans. I took a deep breath and said, "Mom, you really need to talk to Kevin about this. Maybe it's time he learned a little about home maintenance." She was silent for a moment, then sighed. "Tom, you know he's not good with that kind of stuff. Besides, you've always been the one to help me. Why is this suddenly an issue?" I fought back the frustration bubbling up. "Because, Mom, I can't keep doing this. You have another son, and he's an adult. It's not fair for everything to fall on me." To my surprise, she softened, her voice quieter. "Tom, you don't understand. He's fragile. He needs support, and I don't know if he could handle the responsibility." She sounded almost pleading, as if hoping I'd just drop it and go back to the way things were. I didn't. "Mom, Kevin's never going to be capable if you don't give him the chance to try. And I can't keep holding everything together while he coasts by." Reluctantly, she agreed to talk to him, and I hung up feeling a strange mixture of relief and guilt. It was a step in the right direction, but it didn't stop the lingering resentment. I kept thinking about all the times I'd bailed her and Kevin out, the years of being the reliable one without ever once hearing a thank you. That night, as Olivia and I sat by the fire in our cabin, I vented my frustrations. "I feel like I'm just a tool to them," I admitted. "Mom's convinced herself that Kevin's this fragile thing that can't be burdened with responsibility, while I'm just the reliable backup." Olivia squeezed my hand. "You've done more than enough, Tom. It's time she faces the reality that Kevin needs to step up. You deserve to live your own life, too." I nodded, grateful for her support, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. I knew it would take more than a few conversations to break this cycle, and part of me wasn't sure if Mom would ever truly see things differently. I should have known it would end like this. When I started pulling back, setting boundaries, and encouraging Mom to lean on Kevin, I knew she wouldn't like it. But I never expected her reaction to be so harsh, so unforgiving. For years, I'd been her rock, the one who dropped everything to help, and now, when I finally said enough was enough, she treated me like I'd committed a betrayal. The real fallout began about a month after I'd stopped answering every call. It started subtly. Mom complaining to Aunt Claire or her friends, painting herself as a helpless woman whose only reliable son had suddenly abandoned her. I brushed it off at first, telling myself she'd get over it. But then, she started spreading it through the family. I found out from Aunt Claire, who called me one evening, her voice laced with concern. "Tom, honey, I hate to bring this up, but Linda's been telling people that you've left her high and dry, that you're not around when she needs you," she said hesitantly. "She's saying she has no one to rely on now." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of frustration. "Aunt Claire, I haven't abandoned her. I've just set some boundaries. I can't keep being the only one who's there for her, especially when Kevin's perfectly capable of helping too." She sighed, understanding but uncertain. "I know, sweetheart. I understand where you're coming from, but your mom, she's heartbroken. She feels like you've turned your back on her." Turn my back? I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. After years of dropping everything for her, I'm finally taking a step back, and now I'm the villain? And Kevin's not doing anything, as usual, but somehow he's still the favorite. Aunt Claire tried to comfort me, but her words felt empty. I knew the reality was that Mom's perception wasn't going to change. She was dead set on seeing herself as a victim, with Kevin as the loyal son who could do no wrong. And Kevin, of course, wasted no time stepping into the role she created for him. Over the next few weeks, Kevin started visiting Mom more often, but not to help her. He was there to fan the flames, feeding into her narrative that I'd abandoned the family. He'd sit with her, listen to her complaints, and agree with everything she said. I heard from my cousin Mark, who told me Kevin had gone around saying that I was too selfish to help our mother in her time of need, that I was focused on my own life while Mom suffered. Hearing that stung more than I wanted to admit. After everything I'd done for him, for both of them, he was now actively turning people against me. It was as if he saw this as an opportunity to secure his place in her will, to be the favored son without actually having to put in any real effort. And the worst part? Mom believed him. The breaking point came at a family gathering a few months later. It was supposed to be a small dinner for Aunt Claire's birthday, but the tension was palpable from the moment I walked in. I could feel the sideways glances, the whispers that stopped when I approached, and the way Mom avoided eye contact with me entirely. When I tried to greet her, she simply looked past me, as if I were a stranger. Kevin, on the other hand, was in his element. He hovered around her, acting like the doting son, even though I knew he'd barely lifted a finger to help her with anything. At one point during dinner, He loudly announced that he'd been helping Mom around the house and that it was a shame some people can't be bothered to do the same. The dig was obvious, and several people glanced in my direction, their faces a mix of judgment and pity. I felt a surge of anger, but I kept my mouth shut, determined not to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But as the evening went on, Mom's coldness toward me grew more apparent, until finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled her aside, hoping to talk some sense into her, to make her understand why I'd made the decision I had. "Mom," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to talk. You've been telling people that I abandoned you, that I'm not there for you. But that's not true. I've been there for you for years, and I'm just asking for a little balance." She looked at me, her eyes icy. "Balance?" she scoffed. "You've chosen to prioritize your own life over your family. Kevin is the one who's here for me now, not you." I felt a pang of betrayal that cut deeper than I'd expected. "Mom, Kevin hasn't done anything. He's just showing up to look good in front of you and the family. I've been the one handling everything, your bills, your house repairs, your doctor's appointments. Where was he all those years?" She shook her head, dismissing my words. "Tom, you're making excuses. Kevin's here now, and he's trying. That's more than I can say for you." I stood there, stunned, realizing there was no reasoning with her. She'd made up her mind, and nothing I said was going to change it. I turned to leave, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. But as I walked away, I heard Kevin say something that stopped me in my tracks. "Mom, don't worry about him," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some people just don't understand what it means to be family." I whipped around, ready to confront him, but Olivia grabbed my arm, whispering, "Tom, it's not worth it." She was right, of course. Arguing with him, with any of them, was pointless. They'd already decided who I was in this narrative, the selfish son who'd abandoned his family. After that night, I stopped answering Mom's calls altogether. If she truly believed I'd abandoned her, then maybe it was time to let her see what that actually looked like. After that disastrous family dinner and the realization that Mom and Kevin were more than willing to paint me as the villain, I knew I couldn't sit by and let this version of events stand. I hadn't abandoned my family. I'd sacrificed countless hours, money, and emotional energy for them, especially for Mom. And now, Kevin was rewriting history to make himself the loyal son. Enough was enough. It started with Aunt Claire. She'd always been my closest ally in the family, the one person who truly saw how much I'd done for Mom. I called her one evening, finally ready to break my silence. "Aunt Claire," I began, struggling to keep my voice steady, "I know Mom's been telling everyone that I abandoned her, and that Kevin is the one taking care of her. But that's not the truth. I can't keep letting them tell these lies." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Tom, I've been worried about you. I can see what's happening, and I know it's not fair. But you need to show the others, too. They deserve to know what's really been going on." I knew she was right. If I wanted to clear my name, I'd have to bring receipts, literally. So I spent the next few days digging through everything I could find. Old emails, receipts from payments I'd made on Mom's behalf, messages from her asking for help, and records from the countless times I'd driven her to appointments, handled her finances, or bailed her out when Kevin had failed her. By the time I was done, I had a stack of undeniable proof, a paper trail documenting my years of commitment. The family reunion was coming up, and I decided that would be my moment. I'd been dreading it, knowing that Mom and Kevin would likely be spreading their version of events, but this time, I was prepared. When the day came, Olivia and I arrived early. I was nervous, but she squeezed my hand and gave me a reassuring smile. "You've got this, Tom. Just tell them the truth." As the family trickled in, I felt the tension build. Mom and Kevin arrived last, taking their seats with that familiar air of self-righteousness. They avoided eye contact with me, and I knew they'd come prepared to solidify their narrative. But I wasn't going to let them. After dinner, I cleared my throat and addressed the room. "Everyone, I know there's been a lot of talk about me and my relationship with Mom lately. I think it's time I clear the air and tell my side of the story." I glanced at Kevin, who rolled his eyes, but I ignored him and pressed on. "For years, I've been there for Mom. I've helped her with everything, from fixing things around the house to covering her bills when she was short on money. I have the records to prove it, and I want you all to see them. I pulled out the stack of documents, placing them on the table. The room fell silent as people began to sift through the papers. I could see the dawning realization on their faces as they read through the receipts, messages, and evidence of all the times I'd been there for Mom while Kevin had been nowhere to be found. Aunt Claire was the first to speak up, her voice filled with anger. "Linda, is this true? Has Tom really been the one supporting you all this time, while you let Kevin take the credit?" Mom looked uncomfortable, glancing at Kevin, who squirmed in his seat. I didn't think it was that serious," she stammered, clearly caught off guard. "I thought Kevin needed more support, that Tom would be fine on his own." "Fine." I couldn't hold back anymore. "Mom, I've been fine because I had no other choice. I had to be fine because you put everything on me. I've given up so much for you, and you never once acknowledged it. And now, when I finally set boundaries, you're telling everyone I abandoned you? How is that fair?" The room was dead silent. Kevin opened his mouth, clearly about to argue, but Aunt Claire cut him off. "Kevin, I've heard enough. I don't know what you've been telling people, but it's obvious Tom has been doing more than his fair share." Other family members started chiming in, expressing their shock and disapproval. Cousin Mark, who'd always been close with Kevin, looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. "Kevin, you've been taking advantage of this whole situation. I had no idea you'd been putting everything on Tom while making yourself look good." For the first time, I saw a flicker of guilt cross Kevin's face, but he quickly masked it with his usual bravado. "I didn't ask him to do all that. He did it because he wanted to," he muttered, avoiding everyone's eyes. Mom looked around, clearly overwhelmed. I thought Kevin needed more help. I never meant to hurt you, Tom." Her words sounded hollow, an excuse rather than an apology. I realized then that she'd never truly understand the toll this had taken on me. But as I looked around the room, I saw my family's support, their understanding of the truth at last. I knew I didn't need Mom's validation anymore. I had everything I needed from the people who mattered. I left that reunion feeling lighter than I had in years, finally free from the weight of their expectations. After the family reunion, it was clear I couldn't continue like this. I'd spent my whole life trying to please my mother, trying to earn her respect, trying to balance my own needs with the weight of her expectations and Kevin's endless shortcomings. But I'd finally seen the truth. No matter what I did, no matter how much I sacrificed, it would never be enough. And frankly, I was tired. When I got home that night, Olivia was waiting for me. She'd always been my anchor through all of this, the one person who never doubted me, who stood by me while I struggled with this endless cycle of family obligations. Sitting across from her, I felt a weight lift as I told her about my decision. It was time to cut ties completely, to end the cycle of dependency and disappointment. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Tom?" she asked, her eyes full of understanding but also concern. "It's a big step, and it won't be easy." I nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "I can't keep doing this, Liv. They've shown me over and over again that they'll take everything I have to give without a second thought. It's time I start focusing on us, on the life we've built together." She squeezed my hand, a hint of relief on her face. "I'll support you no matter what. You've done more than enough for them, Tom. It's time you took care of yourself." The next few days were filled with a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I felt an immense relief, as though a heavy burden had finally been lifted. But on the other hand, I knew it wouldn't be simple to walk away. There was still a part of me, conditioned over years of responsibility, that felt guilty. I'd been my mother's rock for so long. Could I really just leave her to fend for herself? That's when the idea came to me. If I was going to step back completely, I needed to ensure that she still had some form of support, something that didn't require my constant involvement. After a bit of research, I found a local service that provided assistance for elderly individuals who needed help with daily tasks, whether it was grocery shopping, home repairs, or transportation. It wasn't free, but I knew I could set up a modest monthly plan to cover her basic needs. And the best part? It would all be anonymous. I set everything up, making sure the service would check in on her regularly and assist with any minor issues that might arise. It wasn't the same as me being there, but it was enough. And, finally, it gave me the peace of mind I needed to move forward without feeling like I'd completely abandoned her. When I called Mom to tell her about it, I kept it brief. Mom, I've set up some help for you. They'll be checking in periodically to make sure you have everything you need. This way, you won't need to rely on me or anyone else. There was a pause, then she sighed, the disappointment clear in her voice. So, that's it? You're just leaving? I didn't flinch. I'm not abandoning you, Mom. I'm just setting boundaries. I've spent years being there for you, but it's time I focus on my own life. I hope you understand. Her silence spoke volumes, but I didn't expect her to understand. For her, this was probably the ultimate betrayal, but for me, it was freedom. We ended the call without any warm goodbyes, and as I hung up, I felt a pang of sadness mixed with relief. The next part was harder, cutting ties with Kevin. He'd been a leech on my life for as long as I could remember, using our mother's favoritism as a shield while taking advantage of every opportunity to dodge responsibility. I sent him a short message, laying everything out in plain terms. Kevin, I'm done being your backup. I've bailed you out enough times, and from now on, you're on your own. If Mom needs anything, you can step up and help her. I won't be there anymore. He replied almost immediately, his words dripping with sarcasm. Oh, so now you're too good for us, huh? Whatever, Tom. Go live your perfect life. We don't need you. I didn't respond. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to defend myself or explain. I'd said what I needed to say, and it was up to him to accept it or not. The following days passed with a surreal calm. I spent more time with Olivia, focused on my work, and found myself enjoying moments I hadn't truly appreciated in years. I was no longer a phone call away from being pulled back into the chaos of family demands. Months went by, and life took on a new rhythm. There were no more late-night calls, no more frantic texts from Mom about Kevin's latest disaster, no more last-minute requests to fix something at her house. I'd finally drawn a line, and it felt like I'd reclaimed a part of myself that had been lost for too long. One evening, as Olivia and I walked through the park near our house, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I'd made the right decision, and for the first time, I was free to build a future that was mine, without the weight of family expectations dragging me down. The final break had been hard, but it was worth every ounce of heartache. I'd given enough. Now, it was time to live my life on my own terms. The silence was the first thing I noticed. After a lifetime of waiting for the next call, the next crisis, the next way to fix someone else's problems, I finally had peace. There were no urgent texts from Mom or guilt-laden calls from Kevin. No one asking me to put my life on hold to solve their latest issue. Just quiet. And for the first time, that quiet felt like freedom. It wasn't easy at first. For years, I'd been conditioned to respond, to jump at every problem, to be the dependable son. It took a while to let go of that instinct, to not feel a spike of anxiety every time my phone buzzed. But day by day, I got used to it. The messages that came were from Olivia, friends, or work colleagues, and none of them were asking me to be their savior. It felt strange, refreshing, yet surreal. Olivia noticed the change in me almost immediately. We'd sit on our balcony in the evenings, just watching the sunset, something we hadn't done in years. She'd rest her head on my shoulder, and I felt lighter, like a weight I'd carried forever was finally gone. One evening, she looked up at me with a soft smile. You seem different, Tom. Happier.